Thank you, Andrés, and the organizers, and those who are here and also on the video. I will switch to English. My presentation is in English, so I will switch to English. Este es un proyecto de Semillas de Apego, un programa que desarrollamos conjuntamente.
The Child Trauma Research Program at UCSF. ¿Sí? ¿O lo pongo más cerca? Okay, so this is a joint project between psychologists at UCSF at the Child Trauma Research Program and some economists here at Universidad de los Andes. We've been working in this project since 2014. And the idea of this project is that we're going to try to promote maternal mental health and early childhood development among communities exposed to violence. So imagine forced displacement, community violence, and so on. And the motivation here, and I think it's been discussed already along different sessions of this conference, there's a surge in conflict around the world. Currently, there's 2 billion people that live in conflict-affected settings. There's also a rise in the number of forcibly displaced persons, including IDPs, refugees, and other persons of interest. And in Colombia, this has been prevalent since the last 30 years. We're actually a country with the highest number of IDPs in the world. And the government tracks the number of IDPs and victims, and it's 2 million victims in Colombia. This is approximately 18% of the population. So this is a general phenomenon that affects Colombia and affects other countries in the world. And among these settings, children are disproportionately affected. And here are just some figures and some numbers. 20% of children live in a conflict setting. 35% of the forcibly displaced children, or the forcibly displaced are children. And in Colombia, 50% of the IDPs were displaced when they were children. And among the children, young children, those between 0 to 5 years of age, are the most vulnerable. We know from work in different disciplines that early childhood is the most important moment for development. It's the moment with higher plasticity in the brain. It's the moment where we develop the brain architecture and the foundations for cognitive and social-emotional development. But at the same time, it's the phase that it's the most vulnerable to stress and adversities. Some stress is important. It has evolutionary advantages. It allows us to cope to different challenges brought by daily life. But the problem is when this stress becomes toxic. And toxic stress, the definition happens when there's a persistent activation of the body's and the biological stress response system. For children, this happens when children are systematically exposed to different adversities and traumatic events, and when there's a deficit in nurturing relationship with the caregivers. And as the figure here in the left highlights, it disrupts brain architecture, right? And so you can see the two different figures of the typical neuronal connections in different parts of the brain. And toxic stress disrupts the number of connections and the strength of these connections. And this is also going to affect physical and mental health. It leads to inflammation of different organs in the body. It leads to, disrupts the foundation of emotional regulation. And as a consequence, it can have potentially negative and devastating effects across the life trajectories of these children. So I think this highlights one challenge, and it was our main worry when we started working on this in 2014, in terms of, so how do we protect children? How do we protect the caregivers from the negative effects of violence, conflict, displacement, and trauma? And how do we protect and prevent the intergenerational transmission of poverty and trauma across these conflict settings? So again, important in Colombia, but also important in other countries in the world. So we designed this program called Semillas de Apego, roughly translates as seeds for a better attachment. It's a psychosocial model for caregivers, mothers in general, but also fathers, grandmothers, sometimes the uncles and aunts. So the caregivers of young children participate in this psychosocial model. And the objective is to promote maternal mental health as an outcome itself, but also as a vehicle to foster the healthy child-parent relationships that can protect children from the negative effects of conflict and displacement. So connecting with what I was mentioning about toxic stress, the theory of change of this program is that these nurturing relationships between caregivers and their children when there's emotional sensitivity and when there's healthy child-parent relationships, this can actually buffer the physiological consequences of stress. So it can actually prevent from the negative effects that I was showing in a couple of slides. However, the program, and this is maybe the main contribution and theoretical contribution of the program, is that it recognizes that the capacity to build these healthy child-parent relationships is endogenous. So these mothers not only have to protect their children, construct these healthy emotional child-parent relationships, but they also have to navigate through very difficult circumstances, including trauma, poverty, and exclusion. And we know that mental health problems actually hinder the capacity to build these warm and healthy relationships. So the contributions, and let me highlight a couple contributions of this program. One, it recognizes that mental health or deficits in maternal mental health are actually a binding constraint in these settings. And this is different from other successful programs that have been implemented in different settings. You maybe know the Jamaica Home Visiting Program, the REACH program that actually stems from the Jamaica intervention. There's also interventions, for instance, the Sugira Mirango by Teresa Betancourt in Sierra Leone, the recent Aklam Sim Sim program where there's a Sesame workshop and Lego interventions with refugee children. However, these other programs address a different type of constraint. And we highlight that this is what we can call an informational constraint. So parents and caregivers learn why it is important to promote these responsive care and how they can do this, and how they can do this through play. However, these programs don't consider whether caregivers themselves are emotionally able to provide these stimulating environments and responsive care. And I think in general, as we've seen in recent years, there's a surge in impact evaluations, design of early childhood development programs, but very few of them consider mental health and maternal mental health. So we can see that there's a deficit here. So the second contribution is that we conduct an experimental evaluation in a context of active conflict. There's actually very few evaluations here, most of them in refugee camps where you can think about post-conflict scenarios. Here in our case, 82% of the participants had been victimized, 54% were displaced by conflict, and we were implementing and evaluating the program in a setting of active conflict. And the third contribution, I'm gonna mention this in more detail a little bit later, is that the program is run by the communities and for the communities. And this is gonna be important because it allows us to overcome deficits in professional mental health services in these very vulnerable and underserved settings. So maybe just let me skim through the theoretical background of the program. This is a multi-theory program that builds upon attachment theory, trauma-informed models, cognitive behavioral therapy. We started based on the experience and the curriculum of two programs developed by our colleagues and co-authors at UCSF. Maybe the most recognized program here is the child-parent psychotherapy. It's a clinical intervention, but with the same theoretical context. And we adapted the program to the local context and local needs of displaced and conflict-affected communities. We touch on three different dimensions to try to create these positive effects on caregivers and their children. First, we work on the maternal mental health so that caregivers understand what they're going through. They understand how conflict and trauma affect their daily life, their behavior, right? And so here we promote non-judgmental introspection, sensorial awareness, and self-regulation. We recognize the capacities that these communities and these caregivers have for resilience. And this opens space for them to then better understand what their children need and how they can provide for these children, right? So this work on the maternal mental health side actually allows the emotional capacity for the caregivers to start building these warm and healthy child-parent relationships. And then finally, we also work on trying to promote trust and restore parenting teams. So all these three dimensions are very important by themselves, and they translate into better early child development. How it takes place, participants meet for 15 weekly group sessions, so they meet once per week. Sessions last approximately 2.5 sessions with 15 primary caregivers. All the sessions follow the same structure. At the beginning, there's a stress reduction practice, and you can think about mindfulness, sun salutations, and so on. Then there's a main activity, which is a group discussion and reflection based on arts and craft. So thinking here about art therapy to try to dwell into the different dimensions of the program. And then finally, there's a group discussion on how to incorporate this into everyday activities. So these are how the sessions look like. The figure on your left is actually the first session in the program. There's a yarn that's shared among the participants and tries to create trust and try to create social connections. The one in your right is actually one of the last sessions. That's one of the group discussions based on some of these arts and crafts. Importantly, the program, as I mentioned before, it's led by the community. So we train local facilitators who had no previous training on these type of programs. They're not professional mental health services. And what we do is they go through the program as their participants, and this allows them to then kind of work on the same dimensions. All of them are mothers. All of them are members of the community. All of them are also affected by the same trauma, conflict, and exclusion. And so by working on their emotional well-being, then they can replicate the program. And again, this allows us to overcome these deficits in mental health services that are very prevalent in Colombia and also enhances community buy-in. So we developed the program in 2014, ran a pilot test in Bogotá with IDPs in 2015 with the support of the Ministry of Health. And then between 2018 and 2020, we conducted an impact evaluation. Where we conducted this, we implemented this in Tumaco. It's or maybe I can highlight it here. It's the municipality in the southwest of Colombia. It's a gorgeous place, culturally rich, but also one of the municipalities mostly affected by conflict. Homicide rate when we started the implementation was 101 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Compare these to 29 in Colombia, compare these to 19 in Chicago. And it's also very poor, and there's a very vulnerable. The poverty rate in Tumaco at the time of the implementation was 45% compared to 20% in Colombia. And I think importantly, and this just highlights the challenges that we had to face through the impact evaluation, conflict was happening and actually it surged as we started the program. So this brings some capacity constraints, some challenges in terms of how do you run the program, how do you follow participants, how do you conduct a proper impact evaluation? And just let me highlight one of these constraints. So this is the map of Tumaco. There's like different rivers that come from the jungle. This is actually allows for armed groups to traffic drugs into the Pacific Oceans. The dots that you see there are early child development centers. So we partnered with early child development centers to try to identify the population of interest, to contact them, and then invite them to participate in the program. There's one challenge, and maybe this is not very salient in this figure here, but maybe the blobs that you see are the areas of influence of different armed groups. So different armed groups or different gangs control different neighborhoods, and they establish what they call invisible frontiers. So in some of these settings, you cannot walk from one block to the other block because basically you get shot. And so this brought about challenges in terms of the implementation of the program. For those of you interested maybe in the methodological side of the evaluation, it implied that we had to run a cluster-based impact evaluation. So basically what this means is we assigned the different early child development centers to the treatment and controlled setting. So some centers where the participants were eligible to participate in the program. In some others, we just treated them as the control group. So in general, what this means is that the treatment and control groups looked like this. Participants in the treatment group had the access to semillas de apego, in addition to the regular services provided by the centers, both for children and their families. And subjects in the control group only had access to these services provided by the centers. In total, we had almost 1,400 participants, roughly assigned to the treatment and control groups. We pre-registered all of our study and all of our hypotheses before starting implementation. And let me highlight a couple of notes in terms of how this went through. So to test the impact of semillas, we conducted a baseline for both subjects in the treatment and control group, approximately a month before the program started. Then the intervention of the program lasted for 15 weeks. We conducted a first follow-up where we did not expect to see that many changes or many action in terms of the relevant outcomes. And then 8 months later, 32 weeks later, we conducted the final follow-up to then assess the changes in the dimensions of interest. Because of capacity constraints, we ran this in 4 sequential cohorts. And here, just to highlight, we were almost ready to complete the impact evaluation when we went into lockdown. So Colombia went into lockdown, I think, March 23. We were getting ready to collect the final data just a few weeks later. And this implies that we lost half of our sample for the final follow-up. So the results that I'm going to show that are where we see the main action are just based on the first 2 cohorts. Most likely, the effects would have been like stronger and maybe even more precise had COVID not happened. And according to the theory of change of the program, we're going to measure, we administered scales and batteries of tests across 5 different dimensions: maternal mental health, child-parent relationships, the quality of the child-parent interactions, children's mental health, and also early childhood development. The majority of these scales were administered to the caregiver, but for instance, batteries in the 5th dimension, we actually tested children using different scales. Maybe different to psychologists and other researchers in different disciplines. We are going to bundle up together the scales according to the different dimensions, and so we're going to create indices according to these 5 dimensions, and our main results are according to these 5 indices. But behind this, we do all the psychometrics, and the data actually works very nicely for us. Just to mention, it's very challenging to implement these programs, but on average, participants went to 11 out of 15 sessions. So I think this is a testament to the quality and what participants were receiving from the program. Our experiment worked well. We have balance, we have internal validity. We actually lost very few subjects to attrition, in addition to the pandemic, which is kind of like a more of a covariate shock, but we were able to track the communities and the participants across time. And let me start wrapping up just by highlighting results in 2 dimensions. First is the descriptive analysis that I think highlights the underlying theory behind semillas de apego. And so here what we can see is basically what psychologists have been studying for a while in terms of like the dose-response relationship between maternal mental health or mental health in general and conflict. So here what we see are the distributions of the mental health index according to the intensity or the severity of the experiences of conflict and violence. And we can see here in the dotted line is that caregivers who were more exposed to conflict have worse outcomes in terms of their maternal mental health. And importantly, and unfortunately, this actually maps out into all the relevant domains. So a worse level in maternal mental health then leads to worse quality in the child-parent relationships, more insecure and maybe more negative child-parent interactions. It also leads to worse children's mental health and worse early childhood development. So I think this highlights, again, the contribution of the program in terms of thinking, sure, we want to promote these healthy child-parent relationships, but to do so, we need to take a step back and think about the emotional capacities of these caregivers. Maybe when we address only the informational constraints, we're kind of ignoring the challenges and difficulties that these caregivers are experiencing on a daily basis. And finally, I'm going to highlight just kind of the summary of our results in 2 figures. This highlights the results of the first month follow-up. And maybe as expected, we don't see much in terms of the mental health of the caregivers. We don't see much in terms of the quality, the stress and sensitivity in the child-parent relationship. We do see some effects both on the style and interactions of the parenting interactions, and we do see some effects in terms of the children's mental health and early child development. But more importantly, 8 months afterwards, when we came back to conduct the final follow-up, we have even stronger and sizable and important results on these 5 dimensions. So for instance, the program leads to an improvement of almost 0.14 standard deviations in the maternal mental health index. We see also very sizable results of 0.27 and 0.13 standard deviations in the stress and sensitivity dimension and the style and interactions of these child-parent relationships. And we see these very these strong and even larger effects on children's dimension. Here, the coefficients are a little bit less precise, but I think this is just a matter of the fact because we lost half of our sample because of COVID. Finally, just to highlight a couple of dimensions of heterogeneity, and I think this also speaks to the theoretical framework and the design of the program. We see stronger effects for caregivers who were at risk of mental health problems at baseline. So the program works for who is supposed to be working. At the same time, we see smaller effects for caregivers that are at socioeconomic risk. So those who were food insecure at baseline have maybe different challenges and maybe additional challenges to participate and to go through the different dimensions of the program. And this, I think, speaks to kind of like the Maslow hierarchy of needs. If we're not ensuring at least kind of like a socioeconomic base, it's very difficult for these caregivers to then connect with their emotional world. If they're experiencing hunger, for instance, if they're not being able to feed their kids, it's very difficult to ask them then to go into these emotional domains. And we also see some results according to children's characteristics. We see stronger effects for girls. This is, I think, a result that's consistent with other evaluations, but I don't think for now I have a very strong intuition about why this happens. And we also see stronger effects for families who had younger children. So our children go from 2 to 5. We see stronger effects for those who are 2 to 3 years of age. And this is consistent with the theory of attachment, which tells us that attachment actually forms in the first few years of life. So just to highlight and to follow up and conclude, I think we find very strong and positive results. Our results, I think, at a larger scale speak both to the need and the importance of implementing these community-led psychosocial models in conflict and humanitarian settings. It's very important, it's very needed. When we compare the cost of this program to other relevant programs, I think it speaks also to the cost effectiveness and the potential for scalability. The most similar program that it's implemented by the Colombian government, the ICBF's Mi Familia, cost approximately $600 per family. There's no evaluation whatsoever here. Our program is actually a little bit under $435. When we think about kind of like the gold standard, the benchmark of CBT is actually much more expensive. And right now, precisely, we're working on an at-scale pilot to transfer the operation to an external partner. This is Heartland Alliance, and we've been implementing this already since February in 5 municipalities in the country. And we're enhancing the model with play-based activities that come from Sesame Workshops models. And we're conducting an implementation science evaluation framework to try to identify the strengths and challenges for a proper scale-up. And we'll have results of this additional phase later this year. And with that, I conclude. Thank you so much.